The ideology of the Thanksgiving myth is essentially an affirmation of American exceptionalism and triumphalism. It allows America to sidestep its accountability to land theft and genocide. So who wouldn't prefer that kind of a myth over what actually happened? There's a thing called restorative justice, and what that teaches us to do is to identify what has been harmed and to repair it. And that's a healing that we all need. The oppressor needs just as much healing as those that are oppressed. We cannot begin an honest healing process if we don't bring the pain into the light, if we don't bring that out. I mean, how would anybody know that there's healing that needs to be done if we allow them to believe in a bloodless history?
Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Every culture has core stories, mythologies that have everything to do with group identity. Sometimes those stories are connected to national holidays, as is the case with the American holiday called Thanksgiving. But here's a question: who gets to determine what those core stories should be? And who gets to write history? And what if some of the core stories that we're told to believe in are just not true? Well, in this episode, we welcome two wise women who have made it their life's work to serve as truth-tellers and advocates for the stories of Native peoples that are seldom heard. Lenore Three Stars of the Oglala Sioux Band of the Lakota Nation and Robbie Paul of the Nez Perce People are here to help us to understand the importance of knowing, telling, and listening to each other's stories in ways that bring healing and restoration. And just a note to those who might be sensitive to the issue, there is a brief mention of attempted suicide in our conversation. Robbie, Lenore, welcome to the podcast. I wonder if you could orient our listeners initially by telling us a bit about your communities, about your activities and interests, and things you're invested in doing these days. Robbie, could we start with you?
That is good evening in Nez Perce. I'm of the Nez Perce Nation, born and raised in Great Mud, Idaho. I am retired from Washington State University. I was the founding director of Native American Health Sciences, and I do a lot of consulting work. Right now, currently working for Oregon Health Sciences University, trying to increase the number of natives into their nursing program. And I do a lot of public speaking on historical trauma and healing around the boarding school issues in trauma. And I'm quite active with our Nez Perce Appaloosa Horse Club, doing the Chief Joseph Trail Ride and other aspects of our horse culture.
Now, you have a book coming out pretty soon.
Yes, and I have a book coming out from Washington State University Press, and it's called Listening to the Birds, A Nez Perce Woman's Journey of Healing, and hopefully it'll be out in the fall of 2024.
Lenore, how about you?
Well, I am enjoying living in the beautiful homelands of the Spokane people. Wichachwiyamani and Machiapi. My name is Lenore Three Stars, and I'm in the Oglala Sioux Band. It's one of the 7 bands of the Lakota. My dad is Oglala Lakota. My mom was Cheyenne River or Minikoju Lakota. So I moved to Spokane after a 30-year career in civil rights for the Department of Education. And now I enjoy being Unchi, which is Lakota for grandmother. So the kids are now involved in a lot of sports, and so I'm having a great time out in the fields cheering them on. I spend a lot of time writing and speaking and teaching, largely from the indigenous perspective of decolonizing theology, which is what I needed to do. I wasn't fitting into the white church culture, so I went to a seminary that taught indigenous theology by indigenous theologians, and it straightened me out. I now have a faith life, which I didn't have before.
And of course, people who have listened to this podcast for any amount of time are at least familiar with your name because we bring you up often. As a board member for our organization, Circlewood, you have taught us so much and helped us to shape our perspective as well and to decolonize it, I would say. And we've interviewed you before on this podcast. Well, American Thanksgiving. I wanted to ask you some questions about the stories behind that holiday, but with a caveat. Even though we're talking about an American holiday, it's important to note that a lot of the issues we're talking about, like politics of history or links between story and identity, they're really relevant issues to people wherever they are in the world. So I'm hoping that people will be able to extrapolate from our conversation and not just assume it's a North American conversation. But let me start with a grounding question. Do you and your family celebrate Thanksgiving?
Well, I think we agree that Native people have celebrated some kind of Thanksgiving several times a year. There are many opportunities, and one would be harvest, like the Thanksgiving myth in America that was supposedly centered around a harvest. But yeah, that's pretty normal for Indigenous people everywhere to have ceremonies of celebration and Thanksgiving.
They have different ceremonies in my tribe of the Plateau region. They have the first roots feast in the spring. They have the closing before the fall, the harvest of the fall. They have that feast also. So they have several feasts throughout the year. But also the mythology of the first Thanksgiving, I really encourage your listeners to go to the National Museum of American Indians and look at their resources on the Native perspectives on Thanksgiving. And that first Thanksgiving is a myth that they were all joined together. Yes, the Pilgrims were enjoying their first harvest, but it's because Squanto taught them how to do their raising of their vegetables and things and how to fish and hunt in the area. And they were going to celebrate because they had a good harvest. But then the Native people were not really invited. There were hunters who were out hunting, and they just happened to be in the neighborhood when they saw this ceremony going on. The Indian women were not there. So it was not a joint event where they brought things. The Indian men had shot 6 deer, and so they shared that part of the meat, and so they decided to share what they had with them. So it wasn't just a joint effort. It was just that they happened to be there in the neighborhood. And then also later, one of the chiefs had made a treaty that they would help, but then those treaties were broken, and they started killing the people in the villages and wiping them out.
Obviously, that's such a different story from what most American kids in the mainstream grow up learning. Everyone grows up learning of the story of the European pilgrims traveling to North America, being welcomed by the Indians who are already there, and then they learn to live in peace with each other and share this big meal. How do you think this came to be the dominant story that's the basis for the Thanksgiving American holiday?
Who writes history?
Who whitewashes it? They don't want to face the serious crimes that they did. But I do, if you have teachers listening, I really encourage you to go to the National Museum of American Indian because they do have curriculum for different age groups and different things for them to show, so reteach.
I love it that you're being so practical right from the get-go. You're pointing people to a resource that they can go and learn from, and we'll definitely link to that resource in the show notes for the podcast. Most of our listeners to this podcast tend to be looking for ways to make change, to do things differently. So I appreciate that advice. I wonder if you could talk about this idea of whitewashing, as you put it, or some people will call it revisionist history. For whatever reason, there was a time when a story got created and then sort of superimposed on the holiday. I'm wondering if you could speak to the logic of that. Why does that happen? What's the importance of myth? And maybe what's this myth doing for mainstream culture?
People our age who have grown up with this myth, we were taught a bloodless myth. People like that because it just means we conceded our lands over to manifest destiny. The ideology of the Thanksgiving myth is essentially an affirmation of American exceptionalism and triumphalism. It allows America to sidestep its accountability to land theft and genocide. So who wouldn't prefer that kind of a myth over what actually happened? Lincoln proclaimed that in 1863 when he was trying to preserve the Union. He was elected right before the Civil War. And so he was trying to preserve a union. And in his proclamation, he thanked God for enlarging the borders of the settlements and the mines and the iron and the coal and the precious metals and the increase of population which was not obviously speaking about indigenous people, and saying that these were the gracious gifts of the Most High God. So when you frame colonialism, expansionism in theological terms, then it's very palatable to people.
You used the phrase manifest destiny. I wonder if you could expand on that, because that's a pretty foundational idea behind so much of what happened.
Well, that goes even as far back as the 14th century, when the doctrine of discovery was promulgated by the Pope, and that was a world power. And so the Pope gave authority to the explorers to take land and possessions, to exterminate individuals or convert them if they could. These people were enemies of Christ because they were not Christians. So what the doctrine of discovery did was get to decide who is human. It was a very dehumanizing ideology that because the indigenous inhabitants were not Christians, then they could be subjugated or exterminated and their possessions taken. That was the explorers came to Portugal, Spain, and England. And when America claimed independence from Britain, they said that they had received that discovery principle from them. And so they used it in America as manifest destiny. All of this had been ordained by God, so that theological framework continued and just permitted all kinds of dehumanizing activity that we're still reeling from the effects of indigenous people in America.
I think that that's something that people maybe don't quite understand. I don't think people really understand the legacy of damage that's been done and that continues even to this day.
Right, because the ideology of the doctrine of discovery was codified in the United States through the Supreme Court decision of Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, which basically said that indigenous people in this country were only inhabitants. We were occupants. We had no right to title to property. So once you dissolve the right to property, then you can take everything, and then it led directly to ethnic cleansing when Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830.
I wonder, when you think about the holiday as it's understood today of Thanksgiving, how could a truer story be told?
Well, I have talked in high school classes, history classes, and when I've explained the doctrine of discovery, they've come up to me after class and said, how come I never was taught that? They were incensed that they had an inadequate education. And so I think we're doing kids a disservice when we tell them that, oh yeah, the Indians just gave the land over and everything was friendly. So that is not a good education. And how do they recognize colonial activities that are still taking place today?
Can you imagine a way of practicing Thanksgiving by mainstream folks that could actually be something that undoes some of the damage, that actually provides an opportunity for truth speaking?
I still encourage them to learn the real story of that first meeting, but also look at the tribes that are in your area where you live and see what they do. There's over 567 tribes throughout the United States. Therefore, there's 567 cultures. And so you need to look at the tribe that you're closest to and see what their practices are and get to know them.
We're still here. We're doctors and lawyers, and we want the same thing for our kids that everybody else wants. And we live on this planet together. And there isn't any reason why we can't share. There's enough for everybody.
There's so much about the experiences of indigenous folks throughout history that most people are unaware of. And there are some people, of course, who understand and believe that Native peoples were treated unjustly by European settlers and continue to be. But that might be the extent of their knowledge. I wonder if I could ask why you think it's important that people seek to understand more than that basic level of, yes, there's injustice, let's move on. Why is it important to look at the terrible things that happened?
There's a thing called restorative justice. And what that teaches us to do is to identify what has been harmed and to repair it. And that's a healing that we all need. The oppressor needs just as much healing as those that are oppressed. We cannot begin an honest healing process if we don't bring the pain into the light, if we don't bring that out. I mean, how would anybody know that there's healing that needs to be done if we allow them to believe in a bloodless history? We have work to do.
So For me, it's generational trauma, going back generations, those first wounds that occurred and understanding that in my own family history and understanding how that got passed on. So many of us don't know our story because it was squashed. I was raised in a time where we were told assimilate, assimilate, assimilate. You don't need to know your culture or your language or your traditions. And so I've been undoing those things of my family for about 32 years now. When my grandfather, who was a small boy, he was a survivor of the Nez Perce War of 1877. So he's already traumatized by witnessing war and his brothers and sisters and father dying in the war. And then he's sent to a boarding school. And his mother, my great-grandmother, has to send her only surviving child. She had to send him with love and give him something to help him fight this. She gave him a medicine bag to hang on to. He still speaks Nez Perce 8 years later, even though he's there at the boarding school for 8 years.
For the many people, especially our global listeners, who may not understand what boarding schools are, what they represented, and the damage that was done, could you tell us briefly what the boarding schools were and what they were intended to do?
Richard Pratt thought that he could do a mass assimilation, and so he started the first government boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that was the prototype for all the boarding schools and the residential schools. Kill the Indian, save the man. So he's taken the culture away from them and become assimilated into the white culture. I mean, they were really ripped from their families as young as 5. Try to teach them a skill and take them away from their ways of living with nature, living with the 4 seasons and not going against that, but learning how to do that. My father, though, still managed to do that. He still managed to be very close with nature. He could predict the weather by how the birds sang. But understanding, for me, was understanding that intergenerational trauma because it hurt. It really hurt. There was a particular documentary I was watching that just really affected me. It was called In the White Man's Image. It was about the documentary of how Carlisle Indian School was started. And while I was watching the documentary, I became upset to my stomach, and I literally had to run out of the building and go throw up on the Spokane River. And so that's PTSD, that's secondary PTSD, because I've seen what happened to my grandfather when he went to that school. They were stripped of their buckskin, given a lye bath, given a haircut, and given an English name. It was instant transformation. My grandfather arrives there as Kakune, Black Raven, and he's given the name Jesse Paul by General Pratt. And that's how we have the name Paul. So understanding how that was a trigger for me to understand what triggers those emotions. PTSD is one aspect of generational trauma. There is all kinds of things. Diabetes, alcoholism, sexism, all those things are affected from generational trauma. And so understanding those behaviors so you can undo those behaviors and understand that generational trauma. And learning your story is very important. Telling the truth is truth-telling before you can get to reconciliation or reparation. You got to truth tell, and you can't heal. You got to go through. It doesn't happen overnight. I've been working on my journey for 32 years, and I'm not all the way there, but I've done a pretty good leap, and I've helped my family go along. 32 years ago, we did not do any Native ceremonies, none. And just this past summer, we were able to have 15 in my family receive their Nez Perce names. So I've helped my family in those healing journeys. And the Nez Perce War is another one of the wounds that occurred in my family. That for me, it was on those anniversary dates of Nez Perce War, I was depressed. And I couldn't figure out why I was so depressed until I started putting my story together. My depression lined up with those battles that occurred in the Nez Perce War. Doing a genealogy and finding out what those stories are and understanding that in your life history so you can heal and stop it so you don't have to pass it on again.
The epigenetics that Robbie is talking about, that blood memory, that affects Indigenous people, descendants of slaves, the interned Japanese families, the Holocaust victims. Yeah, so this is recognizable globally.
For me, my beginning was to know my creation story of my Nez Perce people. And my father told me I needed to find that story. And then as soon as I learned to tell the story from the heart, that's when your head and heart comes together and that gives you your power. We all have a creation story, whether you're English, you're German, you're Japanese. But what is it? That is who you are. That is in your DNA. That's in your epigenetics.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Robbie. I'd like to ask you, Lenore, about you and your family's experience of story and healing. But let's first take a quick break to hear from our executive producer, James Amadon.
Hello, everyone. My name is James Amadon, and I'm the Executive Director of Circlewood, the organization behind the Earth Keepers podcast. I also help produce the podcast and am an occasional co-host with Forrest. I hope that you have found the podcast informative, inspiring, and helpful to you as you pursue your own journey of earthkeeping. We are getting close to releasing our 100th episode, and we're not only excited about this milestone, but we're eager to get to work on the next 100 as well. The podcast is offered to listeners freely, but there are significant costs to plan, record, produce, and release each episode. All this is made possible through the generosity of donors. And as we near the end of the year, I invite you to join this generous community through a year-end gift. A gift of any size can help us continue to grow and expand the podcast and reach new listeners. Giving is really easy. Just go to the Earth Keepers website, earthkeepers.online, and click on the donation link. Gifts are tax-deductible and all your information will be kept private. Thank you for listening to Earth Keepers and for all you do to care for the earth.
Lenore, how have you been able to bring these truths to your family and to the people around you? How have you helped them to enact healing around story, around identity, around recovery from collective trauma?
When I first realized that I wasn't fitting into white church culture, I thought I was having a theological crisis, but it really wasn't. What I learned in seminary is that I was really recognizing that it was a clash of worldviews. Because an indigenous worldview is very holistic, and that's what Robbie's talking about, how she's integrated the brain and the emotions and the spirituality, all of those. It's the whole person that you are treating and engaging. From a Western point of view, it's more dualistic than that, because the ethereal, the thinking, the mind is more important than the material. Because you can believe one thing in theology and do something else physically. When I began to see the difference between an indigenous worldview and a Western worldview, then I began to see that that is something I want to pass on to my grandkids. I don't want them coming back from preschool believing that there are these dichotomies, the heaven and hell, earth, mind, and body, that is not a whole person. When you can categorize that way, then you disconnect and you're just not a whole person. So that's what I feel like. I got to be here when my grandkids weren't even walking. And so I got to transform with them. I wanted them to know the things that I didn't know, so they won't have to go through all the shame and fear that Western Christianity teaches you. Like Robbie says, the Hebrews have a creation story. They know who they are and where they came from. And now I do, and I can pass that on to my grandkids, and we can talk about who we are. I feel like they have a better grounding. I heard an author once talk about decolonization, and he said that if your grandchildren know more about their culture than you did when you were their age, you're decolonizing. And so that's what I'm offering my family. And I've been into elementary schools. Had a principal put me on contract for doing just simple things in elementary classes, teaching them that real Indians still are here. We still care about the same things that they care about. And I taught them how to count in Lakota, and I shared a story with them. So to know story is really important. They can find themselves in any story that I tell because they can hear. They may not know legal principles, but they know what's fair. Ask any third grader if something's fair, and they will tell you. You can teach them.
Well, understandably, the Thanksgiving holiday in the States has taken on symbolic importance in the broader conversation about this truth-telling that you speak of. However, I would say there are a lot of stories of abuse and injustice toward Native peoples throughout American history that simply are not told, at least not told in mainstream contexts. The ways the stories are told today erase those stories, or at least occlude them and hide them. What are some of the truths that people ought to know about the history of Native peoples?
I think rather than telling about stories, tell stories. Tell the story of your family. Allow me. Eyapi, it is said that in the bitter cold of Chanapopawi, the moon of popping trees, a young Minikoju family set out to see some relatives. Magaska, which is White Swan, and his wife, Dokiamaniwi, Wak's first woman, their toddler daughter, White Cow, and their baby boy. They were among the many Lakota people who were suffering from destitute living conditions on their Cheyenne River Agency. That was a bad time for all Lakota. Sitting Bull, the revered Hunkpapa chief, had just been murdered at Standing Rock by the Indian Army Police during an attempted arrest. The Ghost Dance movement and its message of hope had been spreading, and it got to Standing Rock, and the Army was afraid that he was going to be inspired to lead an uprising again. Now he was dead. Many relatives left Standing Rock to join others at Cheyenne River Agency. They're close together because the Indian agents can make life impossible on a reservation by withholding food and rations. And Cheyenne River Agency was one of the worst. So they thought they could survive if they could travel out to join Red Cloud's people at Pine Ridge, which is where I was born. So they set out because the Indian agent was said to be a little more fair there. By the English calendar, it was December 1890. The Lakota called this time of year Janapupabawi because the bitter cold made the tree limbs snap with a popping sound. Traveling at that time of year with children and women and the elderly, it was just an act of outright desperation. Along the way, about 500 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry, the same 7th Cavalry that had been defeated about 12 years earlier at Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn, they met them and they told them to camp along Wounded Knee Creek near Pine Ridge. In the middle of the night, the soldiers encircled the encampment with Hotchkiss guns. The reasons aren't clear. Some say that there was a deaf Lakota who didn't hear the order to put down the gun, and some say that the ghost dancers scared the soldiers. But whatever, a shot was fired, and it just became a nightmare of carnage and smoke. So this young family was caught up in that. White Swan was killed, along with the man who were meeting in center camp. Walk's first woman, she grabbed Little Cow's hand, and with the baby on her back, she ran through the smoke and grabbed the first horse she could find. And surprisingly, it was her own horse, the fast one that her uncle told her, be sure you take that horse if you're going. And she raced away on that horse with White Cow in front of her. She felt a thud on her back, but she didn't dare stop, because the soldiers were chasing anybody who was trying to escape. When she finally was able to stop, she was horrified to find that her baby had been shot on her back, and that is what saved her life. She made it back home to Cheyenne River Agency along Cherry Creek and was saddened to see that her baby girl was not going to survive any longer. So she was the only one left. On my wall, I have a picture of Walk's first woman. She's my great-grandmother. Her Anglo name is Jenny DeBrain. And she's in that picture, she's holding a baby, and it's my mom's dad. And I look at her face, it's a sober face. And I just think of the unbearable trauma that she went through. And how long did it take for her to dig so deep that she could find that Wowachintonka, that Lakota virtue of perseverance. And then I look at my mom interacting with her great-grandkids, and I think, this great-grandmother here and this they don't seem that far apart, but they're so far apart in terms of ideology because my great-grandmother was a dehumanized object of a federally sanctioned genocide, and to this day, America does not own that. Native people say we need to make our decisions not just for ourselves, but with the next 7 generations in mind. And I see when I look at my Trakoshes that Grandma Jenny did that, and that's why I'm even here able to bear witness to her story. So that's a strength I want to put into my grandkids.
And you also, though, think it's important that not just your family hear and know that story, but that everyone should hear and know that story.
Yeah, I just started telling it this last year. I mean, I've known it, but, like Robbie says, you heal more and more, just have to keep plugging away. I know there are people out there who have their stories that they want their families, the next 7 generations, to benefit from that strength.
And I really believe that our ancestors are telling us it is time to heal, but you need to know our story so we can heal and help identify those wounds in each generation. Running my thesis for master's, I was struggling with having to put the story in APA format. I finally I said, I can't do this. And I went and sat in the middle of the floor and started crying. I can't do this to you, ancestors. And then as I was sitting there, I could feel a warmth around me, circling around me. And all of a sudden, I knew it was my ancestors. And they laid their hands on me and said, it is time to tell our story. It's okay. So my great-great-grandfather, Chief Utes Malacan, was born in 1793. He was age 12 when Lewis of Clark happened upon us on the Wee Prairie on September 20th, 1805. He's going to become a chief, but he does have to listen with the fur traders and then the government to sign treaties. And then he's sent back to Washington, D.C. to renegotiate. And then great-grandfather, Utes Malacan, dies in Washington, D.C. And so our family has started to retrace those steps to go back. He went back in 1868, and he goes through the Isthmus of Panama up to New York and then down to Washington, D.C. He contracts typhoid fever as he crosses the Isthmus of Panama, and that is why he dies in Washington, D.C. But he has enough energy to say, it is not right that we sell away the lands of my brothers. And he is pushed out a window and is found on the sidewalk during the middle of the day. So we've undone that story where they said he just died of typhoid fever. He was murdered, and he's buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. So that's one of our stories, family stories. The Nez Perce War was very effectual to our family history. All those different battles really affected us. My grandfather, Jesse, had to witness the deaths of his brothers and sisters at the Battle of Big Hole, and his mother and his father. And then they continued through the battle, and then he witnesses his father dying on the trail, and he's buried at Fort Buford. And then he's sent into exile. So trauma after trauma after trauma, and then he's in exile in Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and then he's sent to boarding school. When he comes home, he becomes the progressive Indian because he's had that education. And he starts a ranch, and they have 11 children, but only 3 live to adulthood. He had a son that he'd sent to boarding school, and my grandfather was sick in the hospital, and he wanted to see that child because he thought he was dying. My father was already away at Shalaka in the boarding school, and he's too far away to come home. So the oldest son goes and gets Alex to come home. Alex gets there, but he's so sick that they put him in the hospital immediately. And while Alex is in the hospital, he dies. So he's lost a 6th child. And that night that I'm writing about that piece is the very anniversary date of that death. And I literally had to stop and scream, grandfather, because we know he goes on living. How did you go on living? In his lifetime, how much death had he seen? The death of his brothers and sisters and his father, now the death of his children and a wife and another child. He came to me in a dream that night. He says, I need to be there for the 3 remaining sons. And one of those sons was my father. And that's why I'm here to tell the story. My story began with me trying to take my life. 6 months after my ex-husband announces he no longer loves me and walks out the door. And I try to take my life. And on that night, when I'm taking the pills, a voice comes to me, go home to the reservation, to our ranch. And I know it was my grandfather who came to me and said, enough death. It is time to heal. And it's my grandfather who started me on this healing journey. So healing takes time, but you got to face the pain. You can't go around it. And each time I tell that story, I do heal at a different level. I don't think it's ever easy, but it does help. And helps others to have, you got to have empathy for the other. If you don't have empathy for the other, how are we going to, as a humanity, get along? We got to listen to our stories and help heal each other.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing that story with me. It sounds, even with the pain you describe, there's a sense fundamentally that you're not alone in this, that somehow those generations share the pain together. Let me broaden this out a little bit. Obviously, our podcast has listeners from all over the world, so it might be easy for many to assume, again, that these are just North American struggles. But let me ask you, when it comes to Indigenous people in other parts of the world, what are some of the issues faced in common with North American Indigenous peoples?
Apology goes a long way. The Maori people, they received an apology from the New Zealand government. The Aboriginals have received an apology. The Canadian also have, and they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They have 81 points that they're still trying to work on, but they're getting there.
Well, I think we tend to think that the doctrine of discovery is a historical phenomenon that we're trying to recover from. What happened in this country 150 years ago is happening right now around the world. The extraction industry is relying on laws based on the doctrine of discovery, like in this country happened because of the Supreme Court decision. So legally, the model of extraction industries, that is the economic engine that's driving globally. And so indigenous peoples, they're getting driven off of their land. The animals, they're losing legally. They're just becoming the trail of tears around globally, where indigenous people are being murdered and brutally extracted from their land.
When you face issues like this, when you try to encourage truth-telling, when you look at the hard stories of past generations, on some level that's got to be personally costly. But I'm wondering, what makes it worth it for you? Where does the motivation come from, and where do you find your hope?
Well, for me, it's my family, because they're learning their culture, learning to understand. And to me, this summer when we had our naming ceremony for 15 family members, I was a very proud auntie and mother and grandmother. So it just made my heart swell to learn their names and to reclaim that part of our tradition. So that gives me great hope that my family is trying to heal. That would not have happened 30 years ago. Hearing from my grandfather that night that I tried to take my life, it is time to heal. And I still hear that message from my grandmothers. It is time to heal. And so that's what keeps me going, is my ancestors keep giving me the strength to do this.
That's beautiful. Lenore, how about you?
When I was considering my worldview, there's no such thing as a culture-free gospel. So when I was considering my worldview, I thought on mythologies, which is the Lakota way of relating to all creation. It means we are all created. It means all my relations. But it means we are all related. We're related to Creator, we're related to each other, and we're related to every part of creation, even what most people would consider the dead. But there is nothing dead in creation. All creation is breathed into being. So when I think of that I'm a relative, my job as a good Lakota is to be a good relative. I can't do one without the other. That is, I would say, my bright line. When I'm learning anything, if this is not helping me be a good relative, then I don't need it, because what's good for me should be good for my family and good for my community, because I'm part of a collective. I belong to the collective. I shouldn't go wandering off. That's why I love being Unchi, and I love my grandkids asking me questions. That keeps me going. Hope is a living thing. According to scripture, hope is living. And when I first heard that, I thought, if hope was created and it's a living thing, then that's my relative.
We've been in conversation with Lenore Three Stars and Robbie Paul about truth-telling and about the power of knowing, telling, and listening to stories in ways that encourage generational healing and promote restorative justice. For more information about their work and for links to helpful resources that can broaden and deepen our understanding, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. There you'll also find links to support for those who may be struggling with thoughts of suicide. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Avedon, and our producer is Dave Olfers. Colleen Megerly is our editor and researcher. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.